Welcome back to Thriving in Business and Life. This is Will Wilkinson.
And this is Christopher Harding. We covered last week that whole challenging thing sometimes for us, and that is asking for help.
Yeah, in this culture, it's considered a sign of weakness.
I know. Kind of funny. And we really explored, how to get over that, because we need each other's input. We need each other's help to be at our thriving best. So,
well, it's part of the isolationism that's built into the idea of entitlement. Humans are special, more special than every other species, and then certain humans are more special than others, and they prove it by not needing help unless they pay for it.
Well, that's a whole other show. But today,
just say it.
Today, we're going to really dive into kind of the next stage. So if you think about asking for help, the other thing is to who to ask, right? And so that's one of the aspects of resources. We're going to talk about how to discover resources, how to optimize resources, and recognize them, and be able to use them productively.
Well, and probably we should set a context here that you might say that we're recovering consumers, that in this culture we're really programmed to consume, to buy stuff.
Right.
But our inherent nature is as creators. We're all creative. We create in our own ways. So creativity requires resources, and resources actually are the raw materials for creativity.
As you're saying that, creativity requires resources, and I totally get that. And it seems like, and maybe I'm just underestimating the creativity involved in this, but it seems like just about anything we do, any task we undertake, any project we're heading into, requires resources, whether it's our own, whether it's the food we eat, whether it's the people around us, whether it's tools, whatever it might be. So, it seems like an obvious thing, but I know both you and I in coaching, one of the things we find is that not only do people have trouble asking for help, they have trouble identifying what resources they actually have available.
Exactly. And the remedy to that is starting from the standpoint that I need resources to be creative and to do what I need to do. It kind of sounds silly to even say it, but we can miss that very important point, just charging ahead to do something kind of without getting our tools assembled.
Right.
Getting this job done, and I'm in a hurry. What was it? I think Abraham Lincoln who said, if I have an hour to chop down a tree, I'll take the first 45 minutes to sharpen my axe.
Right.
A sharp axe was a resource.
Yeah. Well, and there's preparation in that. So, I think one of the challenges that I see, in a lot of our thinking nowadays, we're in a hurry.
Yeah.
Everybody's in a hurry, and I think it's easy when we're in a hurry to overlook resources, especially people who might not be in our normal day-to-day mix. We've talked about Toyota before, and what a great job their culture does at promoting the idea of think of everybody who's going to be involved in a project and a process and who will be impacted by it. And make sure you get their input as you're even in the beginning stages so that you're actually creating something and using that intelligence, you could say.
Yes. Tapping into the diversity that gives you team intelligence.
Yeah. Well, and that's one of the things we've discovered, as you know, in our work, is that when we really tap into diversity, and we'll get into this more in our conversation about inclusion, but that what you're actually doing, as you said, is we are literally elevating the group's IQ.
It's true, and it's one of those things that we have to experience to really understand it. Our bias tends to be towards sameness.
Right.
I respect this kind of intelligence or this kind of input, so I'm predisposed to looking for it in others. But actually we want to look for something different, because variety is more than the spice of life. It's the stuff of genius when you're working together. It's very different if you have a lone ranger who's just doing something on his own. But most of the time we are doing things together.
Right. Well, one of the things I know you really focused on when we were writing the book, and we got into this in the online course as well, is how you can utilize resources to help grow your vision. Talk a little bit about what you mean by that. What's the idea behind that?
Well, it's all important if we're going to thrive. Thriving depends on leading with a vision. So you know where you're going, you have your destination in mind, and then you know how to navigate to get there. I mean, here's a very simple example. My wife and I live in the woods here in Oregon. We heat with wood. So all year long, I'm gathering wood, chopping it, splitting it. When I build a fire, I need to use wood. I need to put it in the fireplace, and then I need to use a match. Well, those are very different resources. The match doesn't look anything like the wood. The kindling looks different. And my vision is that I'm going to have a nice warm fire.
Right.
Now, this may seem very simple, but actually I'm gathering diverse resources to fulfill the vision I have.
Well, and so as I'm thinking about this, I'm just going through a vision casting process with a client. And one of the things we're looking at is they've got this really wonderful vision. And now we're looking around and saying, well, what are the resources that we know we have?
Right.
And might there be resources we don't know we have that will help really grow that vision and help it become even more of a reality?
Well, I know you're highly skilled at teasing this out in your work with clients. Some people do this kind of intuitively. Other people have some resistance to it. But we can all learn how to leverage existing resources that we're aware of to find our way to the invisible ones. It requires knowing that there are some invisible ones. I like the iceberg image, that everything we can see is like about 1/4 of what's really there.
Yeah, and I had spent some time listening to a guy who's really talks a lot about vision, and he's tapping into some of the very old visioning techniques. And one of the things he talked about is that if you're clear about, like we've talked about, what is it you're aiming for? Where are you headed? What's the feeling you're creating as you go that is part of the ultimate fulfillment? But he said, just trust in a way that if you're really clear about your vision and where you're headed, that things are going to start to show up that weren't even on your radar.
Yes.
He used that kind of radar analogy. Something's not on my radar. And if you've ever seen a radar, where all of a sudden something appears,
Ping.
it's like, ping, like, where did that come from? Right.
Yeah.
And
it was there, but you couldn't see it until that moment.
Yeah. And so, a lot of times I experience that, where I'm working on something or I see a client working and they have that experience. Suddenly something shows up. It's almost like, whether it was, some people say it was magnetized to them. Other people say, well, it was there all along, but they weren't looking for it.
Well, and there's another way of looking at this too. They said David was created by Michelangelo because he could see that David already lived inside the stone.
Right.
The next step beyond that was David actually lived inside Michelangelo first. In other words, he was experiencing the vision of what he was going to create outside of himself first. And that's really what we mean by leading with vision. It's got to be alive inside us before we can create it outside us.
Well, and it almost goes back to what we were talking about with Thomas Edison, who found 1,000 ways not to create a light bulb first.
Yeah,
but
he's very successful at doing that.
Yeah. Well, in Michelangelo, I remember reading that it was said that he was carving away all the things that weren't David.
Exactly. He just eliminated what wasn't part of David. Right.
So one of the things that, we talk about in the course and in the book in regard to resources is knowing what's the best starting point when you're going out on a quest for resources and fulfilling a vision.
Well, there's different ways to think about this. I've tried a variety of things, and it's a little humbling to admit that I've come back to the simplest approach, which is be very aware of what's already present.
Yeah.
And again, this may sound so simplistic, but often we can be in our heads and be imagining something to such a degree that we're blind to what's actually present with us. So the starting point may be hidden in plain sight.
Yeah, we've talked about brain blindness before and how unconscious bias can actually prevent us from seeing somebody's value or potential contribution. And so that one, I think we understand. It also seems like, and my wife, Leela, is just a phenomenal networker. Mm-hmm. And for her, the starting point is, okay, once she knows what it is we're trying to accomplish, she starts asking interesting questions like, okay, who do we know that might know someone that might know someone?
Yeah, right.
And so she immediately starting with who she knows, but she'll always ask them, like, who do you know that might be interested in this? Mm-hmm. So she's exponentially going out. There was you remember the 7 degrees from Kevin Bacon?
7 degrees of separation. Yeah.
Separation, yeah. And it was, the whole thing was based on that if you went 7 degrees in, somebody you knew Kevin Bacon.
Right.
And by the way, you're 2 degrees from Kevin Bacon. So,
all right.
Just to prove the point. But what they've shown now is that with network theory is that with social media, we are all pretty much 3 degrees from anybody in the world.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
It's amazing, and it's true. The other quantum revelation that is gaining acceptance is that all communication is always two-way. In other words, when you express something, even in thought, Lynn McTaggart says thoughts are things. Even in thought, it sends out a ripple in the quantum field. It agitates the field, and there is a response. It's like radar. Well, everything is like radar.
Yeah, my dad, early on when he was in the military, was in military intelligence, and he was in radio communications. And he said, in later years, that he always felt like thought waves were like radio waves. They were just looking for a receiver, right?
Yeah, well, but to couple that with what Leela does, taking the thoughts and focusing them in words and asking questions amplifies the whole process.
Well,
which is what she does,
She
right?
does, and she's also just great because she's a very enthusiastic person at approaching it with, it's almost kind of like the Tom Sawyer paint the fence thing. She's so genuinely enthusiastic about what she's working on.
Right, everybody around her is saying, I want what she's having.
Yeah, exactly. They want to be part of it. Yeah. So we have an acquaintance who runs an incubator for inventors. And one of the inventions, it goes right to what you were saying, is they have this mechanism now, I'll call it a machine or an instrument maybe, and they basically dial in the atomic signature of whatever element they're looking for, and put that in. You could say it basically sends out that signature into the to the quantum field, and any elements that are in the vicinity with up to 15 miles light up on it's like radar. It lights up and they can see exactly where it is. They're using it for oil exploration now.
Remarkable.
So, these things that seemed like magic maybe some years ago, here they're discovering resources by putting out that same kind of quantum ping that we're suggesting maybe we have the ability to do as well.
Well, we're venturing farther into brain science here, which really I love, and making it very practical with some anecdotes, some stories, some evidence. My wife and I were in New Zealand during February, and we had a number of very synchronous things happen. One was we were gifted a couple of days at a retreat center by the board of directors that I'd done some work with. We arrived, and we weren't the only ones at the retreat center, obviously. In fact, there was a workshop on. Well, what was the workshop on? Raw food preparation.
Which is right up your alley.
Well, especially my wife's. Yeah. And this wonderful teacher from England who now is a friend. But why were they doing that particular workshop just at the time? And they started it the day we got there. Now, I'm mentioning that as one of like 100 stories we could tell, you could tell. In other words, our expectations, our vision, asking for something, even unconsciously, really creates the likelihood of those kinds of things showing up.
Well, and I'll go to the theoretical mathematician friends of mine who would basically argue that if these things we feel are coincidences or synchronicities are actual mathematical probabilities.
Right.
And my conversation with them is I can totally agree that's the case. I guess what I'm suggesting is those mathematical probabilities may be occurring much more frequently than we're paying attention to.
And we just don't see them.
And so, so putting our focus on something really allows us to be aware when those, synchronous things show up.
Well, let's swing back kind of in the other direction towards real pragmatic stuff. And I'd like to ask you a question here, because I know you're very good at leveraging your past successes. I've watched you in the time I've gotten to know you, and you never create something out of nothing. I notice you're always kind of going from one thread to another. Let's talk about this a little bit. Maybe you could share some of your, how do you do that?
Well, it's interesting. I guess part of it is for me, any project or client project or anything that I'm working on, it's a vehicle for relationship. That's kind of a big thing for me. So, in the process of creating something with people, if I form a really great relationship, I'm really looking to be able to continue the relationship. And so it's like, what else could we dream up to do together? And if we've had a good enough time together, a lot of times we can find a way to make something else happen. Yeah. And we did this a lot in the film business in particular. You get a group of people, kind of a large gypsy tribe in a way, that you've worked with on films, and everybody knows each other, and you have this synergy of working together. And, somebody else might dream up the idea, but they kind of call everybody in. So it seems like there is the ability to catch a wave of momentum if we're leveraging past success. Now, the challenge, of course, is we could also get stuck in a rut.
Well, exactly, and I think that it's important to be conscious of that possibility. But as you were speaking, especially relating to your old film experience, I was recalling how often the same actors congregate with the same director in a film.
Right,
You see George Clooney working over and over again with the same people. Woody Allen is famous for this. He has his stable of actors that he works with again and again. And I think it's because they're developing a relationship, they get to know how they work, and they're comfortable. As you say, it can get to be a rut, but it's a formula that tends to work.
Well, so if we're looking at leveraging past success, and then we're looking at past success as a resource.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
And all the relationships that went with it, the momentum, and even, it's kind of the word of mouth. We've been largely fortunate to have to do very little marketing over the course of, our work, because people are kind enough to talk about us to their friends who then call us up. Well, which
is the best kind of marketing there is.
Yeah. I mean, those relationships are super, super valuable, not only because of what they bring us in terms of business, but because, we genuinely enjoy being with those people.
Yeah, I'm just remembering my brother, who's a filmmaker up in Canada, told me that he worked on a project years ago that he was kind of financing on a shoestring early in his career, and he put in a rider. You would know because you're a pro in this field, where there was some residuals promised if the film went into profit.
Right.
So as it turned out, it did,
which is rare.
Well, he was writing checks to people and sending them checks, and he was getting these alarmed phone calls. They're saying, "I just got this check from you. What the hell's this for?" And he said, "Well, the film went into profit." What? That never happens. Yeah. And he said what it did for his relationships with those people was amazing, and he felt like Santa Claus.
Wow.
He was growing those relationships, and every check he wrote, it wasn't, here goes another couple of $1,000 out of my bank account. It was, hey, I'm getting to share with my friends.
Well, as you're saying that, I'm thinking about, too, another resource that I've learned about this the hard way and gratefully the easy way, is that our word is also a resource.
Yeah, for sure.
If people can count on us. Now, there's times when I didn't show up in a way that people could count on me, and that created a real challenge. Other times, I've been able to show up and be just super right there, delivering what people need. So recognizing that our word, our character, and how we show up in any given situation is a really super important part of the equation.
Well, and it's also linked to finding invisible resources. Here's a little story, a bit embarrassing, about myself. I was at an event a few weeks ago here, and my pen ran out of ink. I want to take notes. I always take notes, so I'm looking around. There's a pen sitting on the table, And I assumed there were pens on every table. I wasn't sitting at a table, I was sitting in a chair in the audience. So I grabbed the pen and I used it, and I forgot to return it. But as I was leaving, I kind of overheard something that allowed me to realize that the pen had been for the presenter to sign books. And I took the pen. And as it turned out, they didn't have time to do any book signing in that, but I felt guilty about this for a couple of days. So I got in touch with the presenter, who's in South Africa back there by then, and I said, hey, I picked up this pen. I feel bad. Could I get in touch with your PR person? He sent me the email address. I emailed her. She wrote back laughing and said, well, don't worry about it. But it developed a relationship with her. She's interested in our work, and we're going to stay connected. And that could become a resource that was totally invisible before. I simply listened to a little nagging feeling of guilt that I had done something I didn't feel good about.
Well, it's interesting as you say that, just the notion that, do the right thing.
Yeah.
And that just by the virtue of that, it does open doors, and it builds genuine trust.
Right. Well, let's talk a little bit about the difference between symptoms and causes, because this really does influence what we consider resources and what we can see. If we ignore cause in favor of symptoms, in other words, we're just trying to cut the light that's telling us the oil
Right.
needs changing, then the resources we want are going to be some kind of scissors, right. Maybe some masking tape to cover the light so we can't see it.
Yeah.
In other words, depending on whether we're addressing symptoms or causes, we will consider a whole different range of resources.
That's a great thought. And, it's interesting because we've talked about this before, but this one totally escaped me. I kind of forgot about that angle on it. That, I'm going to pursue the wrong resources if I haven't distinguished between not only symptom and cause, but correlation and cause.
Yeah, and exactly. What are the symptoms connected back to?
Yeah, and sometimes, for example, you see two things happening simultaneously. And so it's real easy to assume there's a cause and effect relationship. And so I go after this one thing that's correlated that may have nothing to do with the cause. And this is, it's why in engineering divisions have processes called like root cause analysis. They're trying to actually get back and distinguish. And I think a lot of times it's very simple for us to forget. I'm working with a client right now, and they're having some challenges with one of their departments, and they're assuming that the cause is this one aspect.
Yeah, right.
And in the conversation yesterday, it began to dawn on them that may be a correlation that has nothing to do with the cause, and they've been going after that like, wildfire.
That is a particular kind of brain blindness. And it's very prevalent. I'm remembering the joke about the experiment done with a fly where they ring a buzzer and the fly jumps. Then they take off one leg and ring the buzzer and the fly jumps. And they take off another one, the fly jumps, not as high each time. And then finally they've removed all the legs, they ring the buzzer, and the fly doesn't move. Their conclusion, if you remove all the legs from a fly, he goes deaf.
I have kind of a weird affinity for flies, so I was kind of like, fly.
Yeah, me too. I wish I could come up with a better story.
But
it kind of proves the point.
I
right?
love it's kind of the, some people use the word idiocracy of, that we don't realize we're probably making those kind of assumptions or correlations all the time without realizing it. And we've talked about bias before. But bias is one of the huge factors that allows us to get confused between cause and correlation or symptom and cause.
Well, I think it was you that was just telling me about a Chinese film you saw with a woman who befriended a homeless man and started to find out what the causes were that landed him in that situation, correct?
Yeah, well, here's since we're talking about that, it's a really great film. If you haven't seen it, it's on, I think, either Amazon or Netflix, and it's called I Am Another You. And she comes to the U.S. to actually explore freedom. That was her thing, and she's a filmmaker, a documentarian. And so she starts exploring freedom, and very early in her search, she runs into this young guy who's going to show her a whole different kind of freedom than she had in mind when she set out to make this movie.
Yeah.
So again, a hidden resource.
Well, it's a perfect example of what we're talking about, because she had a vision.
Right.
And it was feeling based. She wanted to explore freedom.
Yeah.
And so with that as her compass, she came to America, began meeting people. She didn't overlook the homeless guy.
Yeah. She went with her, as she would say it, her instinct, on this. But yeah, I mean, well, and then she basically did what we're talking about. She began to explore it more deeply. She started asking questions. She started to expand the network of what she was searching on. And it is, you see people who are able to be generative. They generate success after success. They seem to almost have like a magical ability to draw people toward them. I was watching somebody the other night, and just how fascinating it was that they were so enthused about something they were talking about. This is in a coffee shop. That before long, they've got a whole bunch of people around them who don't even know them, who are fascinated by what they're saying.
I think the term for that is their reality warp field.
Yeah, exactly.
Steve Jobs was famous for having a big one, so you got around him and you immediately wanted a Mac.
Worked on you, didn't it?
It did. And I never even met him. So this is something that extends out beyond us. One term for it is entrainment.
Right.
We train others to the frequency that we're at. So, it's like birds of a feather flock together.
Well, let's take that, because I know we've only got a couple of minutes left. That entrainment concept, I want everybody to know that this is science-based. There's a lot of research behind this. There's a whole institute called the Heart Math Institute that studies this phenomenon of how our mirror neuron network, and you could see our electromagnetic, energy fields, when we're present with somebody who's in a really genuine emotional state, could be excitement or, so on, our heart rhythms, our brain rhythms, our entire, systems basically line up. And so, the question is, who are you around, first of all? But also, what kind of a field are you generating, especially if you're looking to create things? Are you being attractive and something that somebody wants to be with you and do what you're heading after?
This harkens back to what you were saying earlier about developing relationships, because it's empathy that does that. And there are opportunities that emerge if we're aware of the principle. I had a friend call me the other day, and he's quite troubled by his PSA score. And his doctor is pretty concerned that he has some prostate trouble. His dad and uncle both died of prostate cancer. He's getting into his 60s now. So he's telling me this story on the phone, and he's someone I've coached. He's also a friend. I'm listening very carefully. He's asking me for help. He's asking me for some options. The moment he paused where I had a chance to respond, my response was, that must really feel scary. In other words, I connected on a feeling level. He was kind of going at me with data.
Right.
And I knew that the best way I could help him was to connect heart to heart, to build that relationship.
Well, it opens the door for a whole other different kind of a conversation. So
it does. So we'll be back.
That's right. All right. So I'm Christopher Harding. You've been listening to Thriving in Business and Life, and you can reach us at thrivinginbusinessandlife@gmail.com.
And this is Will Wilkinson. We so appreciate you tuning in week by week. Talk to you again next week.